Now we are moving on to our first panel. It is going to be a mixed format. Again, we are going to have an online participant. We are going to have live presentations. We're going to have a video address, and now we are going to organize a comfortable space here. And I would like to invite our participants gradually to the stage. Olena Kondratyuk, please. Oksana Zholnovich, please do take your seats. Irene Felin. And also we should have Denise Brown, the UN Resident Coordinator Office in Ukraine. She's already there, wonderful. Okay, thank you very much to all of you, and we are starting our work. Now I really hope that the organizers will let me know if we have Irina Dovhan with us online. She will be the first speaker. Is Irina with us? Liudmyla, would you like to say a few words about Irina before we start our conversation as part of this first panel? I will remind you that this panel is called Effective Reparation and Compensation Mechanisms for Conflict-Related Sexual Violence as an element of peace building. Could you tell me if we can already see Irina? Irina is with us. Okay, Liudmyla, go ahead, please. I am happy to introduce Irina Dovhan. She is our friend, head of Civic Association SEMA Ukraine, and this was the first voice that you heard back in 2014. She was the first one to survive this violence, this dark time in her life, but yet she found possibility not just survive but also unite women like that around her, women who survived, women who left the occupied territories. I am proud that Irina is the head of our organization. I am happy that she is opening this panel, and I am happy to give her the floor. Irina is one of the brave people whose bravery inspires others. Irina, we have quite a general question to you about why the voices of survivors are so necessary to hear while developing any compensation and reparation mechanisms and any government policy in general that would have something to do with the rights of survivors and recovery. Yes, hello. I want to say a few words about the organization. SEMA Ukraine has existed since 2019. Initially, it consisted of women who went through captivity and violence in the Donbass. Initially, there were a few of us. We were just 15 women who agreed to unite and speak up about this. This was very difficult. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of willingness to listen to us, but we fought. And in July 2021, with help of Mukwege Foundation and with the Eastern Center for Civic Initiatives, we conducted an event with representatives of law enforcement. Initially, it was difficult, but then the prosecution did get interested and they finally launched cases into this violence. This proves that Russia used violence against women as a weapon even before 2022. After February 2022, the number of cases of CRSV grew exponentially. Currently, we have an entire set of governmental and parliamentary initiatives aimed at supporting survivors of CRSV. Unfortunately, there are now 50 participants in SEMA Ukraine. This is far from all women that we found over the 2 years of the full-scale war. But we expect those who have not yet joined us to join. There are important changes in the work of our organization. We have more impact on the work of the judicial system. There is significantly more communication with government and non-government organizations. We communicate with the media more frequently and more effectively, and we see the results of our activities. Our presence at this conference is an example of a positive change. But so far, we have a lot of vectors to work further. Our cooperation with the most reliable international partners has expanded, Mukwege Foundation and Global Survivors Fund. Women survivors are now constant participants of the working process. Recently, up to 15 women participate in focus groups to discuss the issue of interim reparations. Almost every participant provided positive feedback to this work. This co-participation in this work motivates survivors, stimulates them to help others to go back as quickly as possible to active life. Every woman has her own vision of the reparation needs. Occasionally, these visions are very different. But now we are confident that survivors are listened to and their needs are heeded. SEMA women also hope that the program suggested by Global Survivors Fund, the program of interim reparations, will be extended by the government since its completion, and it will become a good practice that will be adopted by the government as the result of working with international and national organizations. Thank you. Now, who will be next? I guess we will talk to Oksana Zholnevich. I know that Oksana has another meeting, which unfortunately often happens when you have so much responsibility. Oksana, we spoke about government initiatives. Olha obviously introduced the model of this reparation compensation process to us. But when we speak about social support, it is also very important, particularly in terms of justice. So it will be very interesting to hear the government vision of these things. Yes, thank you. I don't have a meeting outside the government. I actually have a meeting in the government, and that's my duty to participate, unfortunately. But I do want to speak. I do want to share my thoughts about how we are planning to develop the support of survivors of CRSV. I want to thank everyone for the measures that have already been taken. I want to thank everyone for their bravery, because I understand that it is not very easy to speak about your pain in public, to become this sort of protector of others who may not necessarily be ready to open up, who may not currently be brave enough to speak. So all of these steps that are currently being taken, all the initiatives, the available international support that's now helping us with development of comprehensive mechanisms, including restoration of justice. And on the other hand, I see two main goals in our mechanisms. The first one is to restore the individual who was affected, to make them whole again, to give them an opportunity to recover and to move on, to find a new meaning while live further, give them a chance to survive this pain and say goodbye to it, or at least to accept what happened to you and make sure it doesn't stop further development. So when we speak about compensation mechanisms, it is very important to consider this multiple aspects. we are not just speaking about financial support, because that's not enough. Money doesn't resolve the issues of people who are emotionally affected, psychologically affected, physically affected. Money can be one of the mechanisms to implement it, but this should absolutely be accompanied by services, by actions. There should be a network of tools, of establishment, of places where a person can recover, where the person will be able to feel that they are not alone. And our task is actually to develop this network. Our task is to organize these recovery mechanisms, protocols of support and psychosocial interaction with the survivor to help them recover. In addition, as a ministry, we are currently developing 2 comprehensive draft laws. The first draft law has already been registered in the parliament. It is called on accounting of women whose life and health were harmed as a result of aggression of the Russian Federation. Its number is 10256. It is on the agenda in the parliament to be voted in the first reading. And this is my big request to all MPs who listen to our event to please pay attention to this draft law. This draft law actually makes sure that we as a country should keep track of all survivors. And there is a category in that law of CRSV survivors. And this is very important because people should use this to be recognized as survivors of CRSV, because in order to get any compensation, the person needs to have recognition from the government that that's what they survived. That is why this register that we are going to use as a government to get information from all our mechanisms, the pension legislation, the medical legislation, and so on. This is already an enormous number of compensations that we are providing as a government, and we are not accounting for them yet, but we should. And the second part is that it is an opportunity to confirm to a person that, yes, indeed, they were affected by the Russian aggression, and they need to get simple documents that would enable them to further approach international institutions to restore their rights. And another point that we spoke about is actually justice. There is also a draft law that we are developing together with MP Bardina. It is about individuals who are survivors of CRSV, and it involves a number of measures because it is not very easy to speak about identifying and documenting such survivors. We understand that people normally approach these mechanisms after a long time. We may not necessarily see physical consequences of these events. We may see psychological consequences. So it is highly important for us to offer psychosocial support to every person, to meet their needs, their psychosocial needs that are usually primary. And only after helping an individual to reflect on everything that happened can we speak about restoring full justice, about applying to prosecution, so on. We understand that not everyone is ready to say this. A lot of people don't understand that they are survivors, even if they didn't fight, or even if they agreed in order to protect themselves and their families. But that's not true, because coercion under any circumstances is still coercion, is still force, and this still makes the person a survivor of violence. And this is what we need to discuss a lot, because everyone who is possibly quietly suffering now should know that they are not guilty of what happened. We have already expanded the whole network that we have to fight against domestic violence. It was developed, and we have specialized centers, shelters, crisis rooms, and each of them already has an opportunity to provide services to people who were affected by conflict-related sexual violence. We are working with our officials so they know how this works. We are also developing mechanisms to ensure that we know how to help and not do any harm, because we may only worsen the situation by insensitive activities. So I'm very happy that we have today's event, that we have a number of people here who understand that this issue should be comprehensively studied. And we understand that this pilot is highly important, will have to be scaled up later. We'll have to make it systemic. We'll have to make stable mechanisms there. We will have to use state mechanisms, because the issue of survivor sexual violence will go on for years, and we have to organize a full comprehensive mechanism for each part of this. This is what I wanted to speak about today. Thank you. Thank you very much, Oksana Zholonovich, Minister of Social Policy of Ukraine. And it is very important to show this process that war crimes have no statute of limitations. So we understand how long this work will take, how big the distance is. Together with NGOs and with the justice system, we also must be prepared to be constantly in a state of work and understand that we can improve things. Liudmyla, we now have an opportunity to listen to a video. Oksana, if you have to leave, it's okay. Let's now turn our attention to the video. Yes, we are going to have video address from Pramila Patten, the Special Representative of UN Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence. And I want to say a few words because Ms. Pramila Patten was in Ukraine. And there is a lot of respect here to our ladies, because there was a meeting between her and our survivors, and there were so many nice, kind words that we heard from our fellow survivors about her. They were impressed with this warmth, this attention, this compassion, and a great understanding of this problem. Let's listen to her words of support, I'm confident, by Pramila Patten.
Excellencies, distinguished guests. It is my honor and pleasure to deliver a few remarks on the occasion of this important event. I deeply regret being unable to join you in person today. As Ukraine marks the horrific milestone of another year of war and continues to resist Russia's full-scale invasion, I commend the bravery and resilience of the Ukrainian people. I'm also encouraged by the unprecedented and steadfast commitment of the national authorities of Ukraine, as well as civil society organizations and other partners, to promote justice and accountability for crimes of conflict-related sexual violence, and to create an environment where survivors of sexual violence can access the support they need and feel safe to come forward. In May 2022, Deputy Prime Minister Stefanishina and I signed a framework of cooperation on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence, identifying priority areas for joint action. An implementation plan for the framework of cooperation was adopted soon afterwards. In December 2023, a revised version of the implementation plan was launched with the support of my office to better track and report on progress. Since then, much has been achieved, but much also remains.
З тих пір було багато чого зроблено.
This revised implementation plan continues to guide the coherent engagement of the UN system, national authorities, and other counterparts on agreed priority areas including the establishment of an effective reparation system for survivors of sexual violence. We meet today with the knowledge that reparations are what survivors of conflict-related sexual violence request most and yet still receive least. Indeed, in my meetings with survivors of sexual violence in Ukraine, including on the margins of last year's United for Justice conference, survivors consistently articulated their need for reparative measures. Today's meeting demonstrates a shared commitment to closing the accountability and reparations gap as a central pillar of victim assistance, as well as prevention and deterrence. It is this destruction of the individual and community that makes sexual violence so cheap and effective as a tactic of war and terror, and why reparations are an essential part of reconciliation and peace building. Indeed, of all the transitional justice mechanisms, reparations are the most directly able to make a difference in the lives of those affected. That is why they must imperatively be extended to reach traditionally excluded victims, such as children born of rape, men and boys, refugees and IDPs, and others whose very survival may depend on interim relief. Although the crime of sexual violence can never adequately be compensated, transformative reparations elevate the survivor and their family from victims to rights holders. Reparative measures can both provide independence to the individual and help reestablish ties to family and community. Reparations go beyond compensation and rehabilitation to include guarantees of non-repetition, which can help to prevent and deter sexual violence so that succeeding generations may be spared this scourge. That is why, through the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict, my office has partnered with IOM and civil society organizations such as the Global Survivors Fund to facilitate consultations on an administrative reparation scheme covering both urgent, interim, and long-term reparations with flexible standards of proof. In addition, the team of experts has regularly offered legal advice and technical expertise in support of ongoing legislative initiatives on reparations. Through my team of experts, I'm following with great interest the discussions in the RADA on the draft law on interim reparations, as well as other initiatives on comprehensive reparations. Additionally, I welcome the establishment of the International Register of Damages under the auspices of the Council of Europe and the initiative of the Ministry for Social Policy of Ukraine to develop a law on the Unified National Register of Human Losses. To address the needs of survivors in a holistic manner, my office has also focused on increasing the availability of support services to survivors of sexual violence across Ukraine. I have leveraged the UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict Network, which I chair, and which comprises of 25 United Nations organizations. Under a joint UN action project, local organizations, national services, and UN entities such as UNFPA and IOM are currently supporting critical hotlines to share information on available assistance, with over 100 mobile teams providing emergency services and mental health counseling across Ukraine, including in temporarily occupied territories. In addition, I'm especially grateful to the European Union for funding a project enabling the deployment of women protection advisors in Ukraine within the Office of the Resident Coordinator, OHCHR, UNFPA, and UN Women, in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2467 of 2019, to ensure systematic gathering of accurate and reliable information on conflict-related sexual violence, in addition to the deployment of national experts in government institutions. Such additional support will no doubt strengthen the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence, reinforce national mechanisms with cross-cutting policy experts by bringing a range of expertise on addressing sexual violence in conflict, from monitoring and reporting to security sector reform, in addition to ultimately improving the availability of services to survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. In conclusion, I wish to urge all participants to grant long-term and unwavering political and financial support to the full implementation of the framework of cooperation. I also encourage all of you to maintain this momentum and further strengthen the efforts already underway to develop a reparations program in Ukraine that would allow survivors of conflict-related sexual violence to see the harm that they suffered recognized, justice being delivered, and their full participation in rebuilding a Ukraine secure in a peaceful future. Thank you.
Special representative of General Secretary of UN in CRSV, and we are now entering the discussion phase with Olena Kondratyuk, Deputy Head of the Parliament. So Oksana has already mentioned the draft law 102/56. What other initiatives have entered the Parliament that maybe require more detailed work between the committees, between the MPs, that may be necessary to approve? And what should be the role of parliamentary MPs subject to this initiative? Thank you, Larysa and Liudmyla, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Iran and Denise. I'm so happy to have this discussion. I see more than 90% of this attendance are familiar faces. That means I don't need to convince you in how important and how timely this work is. I'm happy that we started this panel discussion with a discussion with Irina Dovgan, whom I know since 2014. And in particular, I want to stress here again that this war has not been going only for 3 years. It's been going for 10 years. And we have many more people affected by this war than those affected from 2022. Two very important messages that I keep hearing here and that resonate a lot is the word justice, but also communication. Communication, the importance of this topic should resound. We need to communicate this also to many survivors that are many more than the 224 that we've listed, including 13 underage. My personal experience, I was in one of the humanitarian centers in Spain. It was June 2022, and I was traveling back then a lot, helping people to adapt in temporary stay in the countries of EU. And in one of those centers, I was approached by a woman. She recognized me, and I realized that she wants to tell me something. And I thought she was looking for an employment. I never forget her trembling hands and her eyes. I can feel it even now, that trembling, because it was obvious she was a survivor. She was affected. She was a survivor of sexual violence. And I was flabbergasted because it would seem to me from February to June, it would seem that everybody should have said already that, and survivors should talk about it. But I realized how painful it was for her to even start talking about it. She was standing with her small son next to her. So it's incredible the start of the reforms and, saying that it's not your fault. It's not your fault that what's happened. You just have to talk about. And miraculously, in that humanitarian assistance center, there was a lawyer who took it upon herself to start helping that lady. And I thought we need in every country humanitarian centers staffed with lawyers, because it's so important to collect testimony. Because to collect those testimonies and further acting upon those testimonies is the #1 step in supporting the survivors. And when we talk about communication, You know, Sister V, sexual violence, it's regarded that it is sexual violence related to war and conflict, and it's only rape, but it's much wider. It's sexual slavery, coercive prostitution, coercive abortion, coercive disrobing. The list goes on and on. And it just gives you to understand how terrible, how monstrous this crime is. So, CSRV has been banned and condemned by international tribunals in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. So the current examples of how international tribunals act should be taken as a foundation for the creation of international tribunal that will condemn and prosecute Russian aggression. In Ukraine, CSRV is investigated by Article 338 as violation of laws and the waging of war. That's the only article of criminal code in Ukraine that such cases can have recourse to. Unfortunately, Ukraine still does not have a separate crime as sexual violence as element of war. There's no special law, although the war, as I said, has been going on since 2014. But investigation of all the cases of such crimes is 438 article of criminal code. That's the only article they have recourse to. That's the only, having the register is an important first step. So if we talk about parliament, I'm thankful that we finally talk about parliamentary work because it's an important part of this. In the parliament, we have registered 2 main draft laws regarding this. They've been they are ready to be submitted for the parliament for the general discussion. It's understood how much synergy should be. It's not this is the government, this is the MPs. We should do it. We need to get it over with, to forget of all these norms of whose power game is better in parliament. It's not about that power struggle anymore. So the draft law is very important because it's also about communication. Most importantly, it's about the right of the survivors and restoring those rights, because it introduces the closed court hearing. It introduces a ban to disclose personal data of the survivors to anyone other than those who are directly involved to investigation and court process, and the survivor is allowed to participate in the meeting remotely, which is also very important because that expedites a lot of deliberation, which is an important element of the proceedings, and it unburdens the survivor from the duty to show up in person. And the second draft law, which is now in the parliament, it's been designed together with a union equal opportunities, Maria Можливості, together with Maria Bardin. He also came to the committee on protecting human rights and received a recommendation to include into the agenda this issue as far as possible. So it's a law on preliminary urgent reparation for survivors of sexual violence as part of war, without waiting for court investigation. It's a parallel process, and it's very important. In more, of course, urgent reparations that Olga's definition has presented today about the very volume of those. We can only talk about it in the context of general reparations that we demand from Russian Federation. We have invested a lot of effort together, our international partners and the government and the parliament and everyone, and all those initiatives related to locating and finding reparations. I'm happy that the Ministry of Justice, especially Irina Mudra, who is a deputy minister, and she invested a lot of effort to creating the foundation of the reparation and fund the reparations, and we are expecting the final conclusion from European Commission, and we hope that from 3 to 5 billion euro this year already will be allocated to this reparations fund in Ukraine. I think it's super important because part of those funds, not only the funds that Olga Denysenko mentioned, part of that fund has to go directly to assisting the survivors. It's very important that the fund of compensation to survivors related to armed aggression in the Russian Federation, and that's what I focused my attention.
So summing up, if we are talking about the role of the parliament, and personally from my side, I would like to mention the following thing, that the state should clearly identify sexual violence-related conflict as a military crime. That is the main thing. And the criminal code is considering this crime in the context of Article 438, violation of laws of war. If we need to have it separately, this crime, then we need to work on that also. But it seems to me that the lawyers should give us some advice here, representatives of Prosecution General, how to do that best of all. I don't see a big problem in that, whether we keep that next to 438 or have it separately. And of course, compensation for this type of military crimes has to happen in the general context of compensation for the other military crimes. And the work on this should be conducted very fast, and Russian Federation has to pay for everything. I would like to mention also that even for helping this, we have the investigative committee at the parliament, which is working on the opportunities of learning more about sexual crimes, etc. So if necessary, also here is our work, and almost all the representatives of different political parties are included. So there's nothing to say about some being separated. We are just united regarding this topic. In general, I would like to mention that the topic, we have so many urgent topics related to human rights, and that is one of, I would say, really sensitive topics. Not everybody is able to tolerate the discussions in society on this topic. Let us speak sincerely, because it's always been somehow closed topic, and from the side of the survivor there was always a lot of hatred, etc. And now we have, another empty, in my opinion, space when we can talk about the problem, but we have to talk also about the ways to solve that as soon as possible. At the end, ending up my brief speech, I would like to say that I read in the morning a brief post from Alexandra Matvichuk, and I respect her greatly as one of the defenders of human rights. She said that events in Odessa, when now we can see really terroristic murder of 5 children, 2 babies among them, it only says that the anger and the fury that we have should stimulate us to cope with this feeling of justice. And I think the joint efforts that we should provide to this impulse will lead to the fact that Russian Federation, each criminal, will pay for this crime, no matter what it is. So talking about supporting survivors, I'm incredibly proud of the fact whom I see here. I would like to thank you for being brave. You mentioned that it's the first time that you sit in the front row. I think that, these are like icebreakers, people who are speaking first. And I think that many people will follow you. It's a good example. So we can only thank you today. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the words of support. That is incredibly important. And now we will hear the video from the Prosecutor General. And today, a lot of things were mentioned about justice. You were mentioning that for us, for me personally, I know that for many girls, justice, it means that these people have to be punished. When they were doing this, when we were in captivity, they were putting a bag on our head so that we don't see them. And I thought that it's not only due to their fear of us, in their fear that later on we will recognize them. Because I want to believe that they were ashamed to do that. They were doing that without choosing who's younger or who's more pretty among girls or boys. They were doing that because of their nature. And later on, when they were taking us, if we were not in bags, then they were putting a mask on their face. But that still gives us the opportunity to punish them. I'm grateful to Prosecution General because they are doing a lot in this direction. And I know no matter how hard they hide their faces, they will be found. No matter how much they are scaring those who are under occupation nowadays, people cannot be scared because those are not us who should be afraid. They should be afraid. We should not be ashamed of anything. They should be ashamed of the things that they did. And the most important, the feeling of justice, I think that it's not like some person should be just punished. You were talking about the fact that military crimes should be recognized of Russian Federation. That is the military crime. I really want us not to forget it and to fight for it to be recognized this way. Let us listen to Mr. Andrei Kostin, Prosecutor General, and I think that he will give us some hope now in these investigations and these horrible military crimes. Greetings, dear participants. I'm sorry that I cannot be present personally on this important event, because the things that you do are the things that are needed by our people nowadays. It is restoration of justice. Recently, our partners have made the study of public opinion. It confirms incredibly high request for justice, reparations, compensation of damage. This is a good way to ensure some justice in action. And of course, survivors of such crimes as CRSV, they require urgent justice. And I'm grateful to all the institutions and international partners who are involved to payment cash compensations for survivors of such crimes. We do need systemic and regulatory changes in order to launch this necessary and timely project. In particular, we need to regulate the obtaining of the status of survivor. That is a very important form of recognition. And those who survived CRSV, they mentioned it, questioned in the framework of the Global Survivors Fund. Such reparations should be available independently whether the person is coming to law enforcement agencies or not. At the same time, the investigations of the Global Survivors Fund, they say that survivors don't need just financial support, but they need also medical support, long-term and available psychiatric and psychological support of survivors and their family members during courts and trials. Incredibly important is social support and legal support, and then possibility to study, ensuring housing for them, help with regaining documents, etc. So our joint aim is to ensure complex, holistic, and aid on all the stages of criminal procedure and ensure clear and transparent regulations so that access to this help is easy and convenient for all the survivors. I'm really grateful to the government of Ukraine for developing everything necessary in order to implement this program of reparations. Thank you to our international partners for their expertise and support in the implementation of mechanisms of ensuring compensations and supporting survivors. I'm grateful to all the partners from the civil society who always on the first line, and they provide targeted support where it's needed most. I wish you to have fruitful work in the framework of this international platform, which is dedicated to restoration of the survivors' rights, conflict-related sexual violence survivors. I am sure that with joint efforts, we will be able to ensure justice for survivors of these horrible crimes. We are very grateful to Mr. Prosecutor General for his voice, for his position and his support. The only thing I would like also to talk about before giving the floor to Ms. Denise Brown, we have a lot of words in our language, and some of them are really traumatizing, some of them are really sensitive. If we are talking in legal language, then the word survivor means the status. It is the status of the survivor, and when the criminal justice starts. When we are talking about survivors, again, or those who suffered, it's much broader notion than just the criminal process. It's just about that. But I am asking you to avoid the word victim in your public speeches, because it's victimizing people. And I would like to hear that, like, when people are talking about me, and when we are talking about brave people, about people who are talking about the crimes they went through and how they are supporting others, I'm asking you to be careful in the words that you use, because sometimes it's wounding much more than some actions. And currently, I would like Denise Brown to start talking to us, coordinator of programs, UN programs in Ukraine, and we already heard Ms. Pramila Pattern. But it's incredibly important, the role of the UN organization which is responsible for the rights, safety, and security, which knows and feels their role in these processes, in particular the process of supporting survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So, Ms. Denise, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And like previous speakers, I have to start with recognizing the presence of the survivors who stood up this morning. One of the major issues we have had here in Ukraine, but also in other contexts, is that it's so difficult for survivors to step forward. But your stepping forward will help others. So thank you very much. And I also want to recognize the presence of those I've met in Kherson and other places who also worked on gender-based violence. And I'm so glad that we're all together today. But first I wanted to start with a quote from a colleague who said this to me years ago, and I was thinking back through my experience on conflict-related sexual violence, and I thought I could share it with you. It's very brief, but I think quite important. Sexual violence during conflict has proven highly effective in breaking morale, particularly where women are raped in public or where relatives are coerced into participating. Widespread and systematic sexual violence hampers sustainable post-conflict recovery. That's a very powerful statement, but it's a very big problem. And conflict-related sexual violence is not new. It goes on, and we heard earlier, not only in Ukraine, but right now in the Sudan in huge numbers, and in the Middle East. But going back decades and decades, rape used as a weapon of war. About 20 years ago, there was a major incident of conflict-related sexual violence in a small country many of you may not have heard of, which is Guinea in Africa. And in civic demonstrations that were then repressed, there were hundreds of rape. That led to 2 Security Council resolutions being passed, 1820 and 1888. And that's when the Office of the Secretary General announced a special representative for conflict-related sexual violence. You saw Pramila Pattern a few minutes ago. She has that office right now. But that was a signal that this is a huge problem that wasn't being spoken about, wasn't being addressed. So Resolution 1820 calls for the protection of civilians from sexual violence, the enforcement of military discipline, and the prosecution of perpetrators. Now, why is a Security Council resolution or a General Assembly resolution important? Because that's the document that all the member states agree on and say, I will not do this, I will do that, right? Most member states respect those resolutions. Most of them abide by those resolutions, but we know that in the context of Ukraine and the Russian Federation, they have violated the UN Charter, they have violated international humanitarian law, and they are violating as well the Security Council resolutions, and that is absolutely critical from an accountability point of view for the political and military leadership that is making those decisions. So that is the first point I wanted to make on the contribution of the UN. The second is very much what we do here in Ukraine with the Office of the Vice Prime Minister, with civil society, with so many organizations. And we're very pleased that we've been able to, with the Office of the Vice Prime Minister, establish 11 survivor centers since June 2022. Not enough, totally not enough. And I remember sitting a year ago in the Vice Prime Minister's office, and we were looking at the numbers of people, and the Commissioner, who's here today, we were looking at the number of people coming to those centers, and we scratched our heads and said, people aren't coming. They're not coming to these centers, we have a problem. And we had an issue of communication, and that was subsequently resolved. So since those 12 centers, and they were established over time, not all at the same time, but the first one was in, if I'm not mistaken, June 2022 in Zaporizhia, over 32,000 people have come to those centers. Now, this is not just conflict-related sexual violence, but also gender-based violence. But in those centers, people can find psychological support, medical support, social support, and legal guidance. Right? So all of those services in one place. But what we also know is that the majority of people going to these centers are women and girls, the overwhelming majority. And I want to come to, in a moment, an issue of the gender dimension of conflict-related sexual violence. So the centers exist, they are functioning, there may need to be more. Listening to the conversations today, the question I ask myself is the legal advice that's given in those centers, how do we then connect it to the Office of the Prosecutor General? We do have in the UN the High Commission for Human Rights that works with us in Ukraine. They work with the dedicated team that the Prosecutor General's office has on conflict-related sexual violence, but there's so many cases. There are so many violations, not just conflict-related sexual violence, but international humanitarian law, over 100,000. So how do we then prioritize these cases of conflict-related sexual violence and better connect with the centers? I think that's something we can reflect on more. Within the program that we carry out here with really great support from the EU is also training and capacity support for the first-line responders. In particular, we've been focusing on medical professionals, psychologists, counselors, and also the media, and I'll say more about that. When people come forward, they need to be well received. They need to be received in a way that is supportive, confidential, and reassuring. So we've been working very closely with the Vice Prime Minister's office in order to ensure that those first-line responders have the necessary understanding and information to do that work. But the media plays a huge role. I think one of you mentioned it earlier. We have in other contexts huge stigmatization around conflict-related sexual violence, particularly around men and boys, and absolutely shocking and horrendous accusations made afterwards in the media about what did and didn't happen. So we have really also been focusing on the media. More needs to be done, but that has started. What we'll also start in 2024 with the UN and the Office of the Prosecutor General is training his prosecutors in the regions, so that what we've been doing here in Kyiv also is decentralized, and that I think that's a hugely important point in Ukraine. And of course, documentation of the cases, not just in the territory, vast territory controlled by Ukraine, but also in those temporarily occupied areas by the Russian Federation. And we do have a report coming out in a couple of weeks on violations across the board in those territories, which we spoke about last week in the United for Justice Conference of the Prosecutor General. But we have to remember, and we will continue to look at the services that are provided, so that we remember that the consequences go beyond the survivors. First, this has the potential to destroy, disrupt families and communities. And it's typically not one person who's violated, there's many. Second, the fear of sexual violence then restrains women's mobility, limiting their participation in the economic center and girls going to school. And thirdly, when perpetrators of sexual violence go unpunished, then the relationship between the individual and the state's ability to protect its citizens is questioned. So these are all things we need to keep in mind moving forward. Just before I finish, I wanted to touch on the gender dimension. As difficult it is for women and girls to step forward, in every other country we work in, we know it's just even so much more difficult for men and boys to step forward. There's a gap of knowledge as to how to adapt the services for men and boys, and often, I think, an issue of communication. How do we build that trust together for them also to step forward? Given what I said earlier, we've seen in other countries the stigmatization is horrendous, and why would you put yourself in that situation? So this is really something we've been discussing. There's a sub-working group that has been established at a technical level to think through this. And of course, we work very closely with civil society and the survivors' networks, so we take that important information and adapt what needs to be adapted. So I just want to finish by saying conflict-related sexual violence is combustible. It brings together a complicated mix of shame, guilt, and fear for the survivor, for the family, and for the community. And so we're dealing with different layers here. And in the UN, we no longer say victim. It's only survivor, because that way you shift the balance of power from the perpetrator and you give the power to the survivor. And we think this is incredibly important. And thank you so much for inviting us and allowing us to contribute to this very, very important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Denise, for your words of support. This is very important to us. And now we are going to have another video address. But before that, I would like to say a few words, and thank you again for your support. This is very important that the global community is behind us on this, that it is helping us understand how we can do it better, that it is listening to us and to what the primary needs are that need to be met. Olena, you spoke today about a meeting in Spain with a woman who is a survivor. You know, we have women who are members of our organization, who are also abroad in Europe. I know that a lot of people leave temporarily occupied territories. They go to Europe, they remain there for adaptation. But for a while, there was no information component. They didn't understand what was happening under occupation. And there are women there who survived the CRSV. They don't know how to handle it. And I think it would be a good idea if, at least in some countries, we set up centers helping, certain hubs helping our citizens who survived this violence. I think it is not only a lawyer who is necessary, but also a psychologist who could provide some sort of assistance to these people. But this is also subject for broader discussion. I am happy that we have an opportunity to speak about this. We are going to talk about this in more detail later. And now we have a video address of Stella Runengrovich.
Dear participants, thank you for allowing me to speak at this important conference on restoring the rights of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. While I regret that I could not make it to the conference in person, I regret even more that Ukraine had the sad occasion to mark 2 years of Russia's brutal war of aggression on your country with an enormous human cost. The EU has, from the early stages of the war, consistently called for the necessary mechanisms to address sexual and gender-based violence. We have supported the joint efforts of the Ukrainian authorities and the UN to this end. I traveled myself to Kyiv several times to engage with the Ukrainian authorities on their strategy to ensure justice and accountability for the perpetrators of sexual violence. It is clear that all my interlocutors, from Ukrainian women's associations to Government Commissioner Levchenko and Deputy Prime Minister Stefanishina, have been deeply engaged in getting this right, in establishing trauma-informed response mechanisms and working for stronger accountability frameworks. Reparations form a fundamentally important part of this, enabling survivors to move forward, to have a future. This will require financial allocations and prioritization, also from the national budget. The recovery planning will need to consider how to address the needs of survivors. Reforms aligned with EU accession requirements may provide an additional impetus to take into consideration the need of reparations. As Ukraine is moving forward on its path to the EU, it is well placed to ensure accountability for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And the EU is firmly set to support Ukraine to do so. We have the same vision, that the post-war policy frameworks stay ambitious, that finances are allocated to gender equality and gender-based violence responses, and that streets and cities are rebuilt with women's safety considerations in mind, and that all survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are provided with justice and reparations. I am with you in all of these efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, EU Ambassador on Gender Equality and Diversity. And now we are getting closer to our final presentation by Ms. Irene Felin, NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security. Irene, one of the aspects of reparation mechanisms is a guarantee of non-repetition. A guarantee of non-repetition is part of the security and safety challenges. Could you just say a few words if NATO has a concept regarding this, where NATO could launch this mechanism or help with its development, so that these guarantees of non-repetition would be felt by everyone, especially people who are currently in captivity or in temporarily occupied territories, so that they would understand that not only do they gain support, but also that there will never be trauma like that again.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by echoing the other speakers on how unique this opportunity is for me today to be here, but especially I think for the survivor to have shared and initiated this process. And I'm particularly impressed by the different stakeholders that you were able to bring in this room today. And this is really a demonstration on how the understanding today is of the gravity of this phenomenon, and how only collectively we will be able to prevent this from happening again. I certainly bring a different experience and different voice now as part of this panel. We talk a lot about NATO and Ukraine relationship, and we are working every day to make this more sustainable, not only today, but also in the medium and long term. Let me start by first highlighting the importance of non-repetition or non-recurrence as part of reparation mechanisms for survivors of CRSV. This matters for all. It matters initially for the individual survivor, but also, as it was mentioned, for the community and the society as a whole. And this is not only in terms of the personal healing, but also in terms of looking forward and the assurance that this will not happen again, and then the future generation will not experience such violence. If we talk about guarantees of non-repetition, those can include a very different range of measures that are aimed at addressing the structural causes of the violation experience, which means that we have to look at the transformative dimension for CRSV not to happen again. A lot of the work I do when it comes to women, peace and security agenda more broadly, and then specifically on conflict-related sexual violence, it addresses cultural mindsets. And this is from where I think we have to start always. Of course, we have to put in place measures, but we need to address the culture that is behind, that leads to certain facts to happen. So NATO as a political military organization can make a contribution to a number of those measures, in particular those addressing security and defense sectors. And I would like now to highlight some of them very briefly. Of course, guarantees of non-repetition should be designed taking into account the causes of sexual violence with a view to effectively prevent it in the future. In this regard, of course, each and every circumstance is different, and different the country and the culture where this is happening and the war. But certainly we can identify patterns that are common in all conflict and crisis. And this is starting from there that we need to design our measure. While this work is context specific, the general root causes are based on gender inequality and patriarchal culture. And in this regard, as an alliance, the recognition of gender equality as a reflection of our core values, as it is now stated in the strategic concept that was endorsed by head of states and governments at the Madrid summit in 2022, was a major step for the alliance. The commitment to advance gender equality, as I said, as a reflection of our core values, provide the basis for addressing root causes of CRSV and more broadly of women, peace and security, and working towards structural changes. So this is not only what we do on a daily basis, but it represents who we are as an alliance. And the second measure is contributing to guarantee no repetition in the establishment of a coherent policy framework to prevent and to respond to CRSV. This is why all the work that is done at the Parliament here is extremely important, because we can talk about this, but if the legal measures are not in place, then its accountability, it will remain very difficult. And this is why at NATO we also work within the House, within the Alliance, to develop this right policy framework that are then supported by implementation plan. But this is also why we support our partner in doing the same, because having a common standard is essential as part of our interoperability work. So we have work on establishing this framework in the past years, and now I'm trying to connect the different dots on the policy that NATO has in place. As I mentioned already, the new strategic concept endorsed in 2022 was for us an important step, because it's underlined the importance of working on the implementation of women, peace and security and human security agendas, both of them across all the work that NATO does. And this is essential as part of my understanding and my mandate at the Alliance, that we don't work on silos. I think we are in a stage where we still need to have dedicated events and policy as today's, but at the same time, we want to see this across the work we do. And this is when we really connect all the different political and strategic priorities, and we will see the result on our actions. And this is why we work across the core tasks at NATO. So it's the three core tasks, which are deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security. And the different areas where we work, and we see this connected also, is the women, peace and security on one side, but then on the others were the different policies that exist. And in 2021, a dedicated policy on preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence was endorsed. And we have also one on protection of civilians, one in children and armed conflict, and combating trafficking on human beings. And they all promote the respect, protection, and promotion on international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And if you are interested in knowing more about this work, they are all policies that are available online, but you can also reach out to our colleague present here in Kyiv and Ukraine, but also directly to me. Because for us, it's important to connect the work we are doing back at the headquarters, you know, with the work that it's done then on the field, and to see how we can better frame our policies and actions based on the needs of the Ukrainian population. The policy framework is very important because this helps us in connecting the strategic level then with a tactical one. We work close in synergy between the political side of the house and the military on the other one. And this is the only way we have working in close synergy then with the military, with the defense and security sector, to deliver the alliance commitment to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. And this brings to the third point, which is the operationalization of the policy framework, developing action plans, military doctrines and guidelines, and which means including this dimension in education, in training, and in exercise, and many other aspects. Let's pick one, education and training, as one of the measures of how we implement this work. For example, our policy requires a mandatory pre-deployment training for all personnel deployed in NATO missions, operations, and activities on identifying, preventing, and responding to CRSV. This specific training is supported by a broader range of education and training efforts, which include the integration of gender perspective in this specific phenomenon as it was described earlier. And it's very important what you said earlier, because we often had the tendency to focus only on women and girls as survivors. But I see also within the conversation of the Alliance that we address now men and boys and the different contexts where this happens. The pre-deployment training is a responsibility for allied nations to be prepared and delivered. Is not for NATO as an alliance, but is a national responsibility. What we want is to see the same standard across all allies, and this is where my office, in collaboration with the strategic commands, is working to develop the right standards. But at the end, the responsibility remains with nations, and this will apply also in our cooperation with partners, leading me to what we can do better together when it comes to these areas. This helps us, as I said, to set the standards and helps us to be more interoperable. When I like to talk about interoperability when it comes to gender standards. It is easier to talk about interoperability when we talk about ammunition, how we defend the country, and this is why we exercise together. It is more complex talking about interoperability when we talk about those values and how we implement those agendas. But for me, it's essential. This is how we will be able to defend ourselves and be on the field at the same time, promoting the same values. And we work around, we frame our partnership and our standards when in a framework that is called the Individual Tailored Partnership Program. And this is how we include women, peace and security, conflict-related sexual violence, and human security consideration in the work that we do. Before concluding, I would also mention that historically in this partnership programs, which apply to Ukraine, but all other partners NATO has across the globe, very often the dimension was for NATO to train and to exchange information and lessons learned from our own operational missions to the partner countries. Here we see the shift and we see the change. We see how our relationship has changed between NATO and Ukraine, and we see how this exchange is, and we build more and more in two ways. Exchanges of lessons learned, and especially what Ukrainian is learning during this war. It will be essential for NATO to be applied to our own training and education. And this is why establishing a center for lessons learned is important. And for me, it will be extremely important to have this dimension, the work on women, peace and security, and on conflict-related sexual violence as part of this consideration. It will be essential. So let me conclude by highlighting again how important it is for me and for us to be present today, to be part of this, this project, and to provide our work as a platform to support what you are doing today, and we will do together in the future. Thank you again.
I am very thankful to each of you for this conversation.